I'm Sergio Villalbazo, and I'm very happy to present my paper on inequality and asset prices during sudden stops. So let me start by saying that financial crises of the sudden stop type, these are the episodes in which international capital stops flowing into an economy, have happened a lot. Just in the last 3 decades, there have been more than 50 episodes across emerging and advanced economies. So this is a global phenomenon. Now we know that these crises are characterized by declines in asset prices, which affect households differently. To give you an example of this, during 2009 crisis in Mexico, the households that had high leverage, this is the households that had a lot of debt relative to their assets, decreased their expenditures by around 6%, while the households that had no debt at all increased their expenditures by 5%. So it's not only interesting to see how aggregate shocks affect households differently, but also in this paper, I'm going to argue that how different these households are or how unequal is going to play an important role determining the aggregate effects of the crisis. So inequality is going to play is going to matter for the severity of the crisis. And I argue that there are two effects why ex ante the role of inequality is ambiguous, because there are dampening and amplifying effects coming from the leverage and wealth distribution of the households. To be more specific, in this paper, I study the cross-sectional dimension of Fisher's debt deflation mechanism. First, I give empirical evidence that such a dimension operates via these two opposing effects. Think of the amplifying effect as the effect that comes from the households that are financially vulnerable or collaterally constrained, and they have to fire sale their assets once asset prices are dropping. This behavior introduces amplifying forces into the drop on asset prices. And notice that here, if we think about a distribution of households, there are intensive and extensive margins. Households that are already constrained will have to fire sale more, while households that are close to the constraint are going to end up constrained, this is the extensive part, and will end up fire selling. Now, on the other end of this leverage and wealth distribution, there are going to be the wealthy, unconstrained households that will take advantage of the depressed prices and are going to start accumulating them. And this behavior will dampen the aggregate drop on asset prices. Now, conventional or standard models in the literature cannot account for these cross-sectional effects, mostly because they use representative agent frameworks. And for this reason, I propose a small open economy asset pricing Bewley model with aggregate risk. And this model is going to be able to explain sudden stops key stylized facts. And in contrast to the representative agent framework, the model with heterogeneity predicts that sudden stops are persistent, asset prices will drop less, but consumption is going to drop more, which is something that we see in the data. And lastly, hopefully by this time, I have convinced you that the model is a good framework to study sudden stops, and I will use it to quantitatively assess the effects that different degrees of inequality have on the severity of crisis. I will calibrate two different economies, one comparing, and the exercise is going to be to compare an advanced and an emerging economy that have different degrees of inequality. And I will find that the more unequal economies experience more severe sudden stops, which is also something that we observe in the data. So now, in the interest of time, let me skip the related literature and go directly into the data. The laboratory that I'm going to study is Mexico's 2009 sudden stop. In aggregate terms, it was a severe crisis. The MB spread increased 200 basis points, and aggregate consumption dropped around 5%. However, when we look at the micro data, the behavior of the households depends on the composition of their balance sheets. So we're going to see a lot of heterogeneity. To analyze this, first, I'm going to show you the differences in the asset positions of these households. How are they selling or buying different assets? So to do this, I will take the households. This is a panel household survey in which I am able to follow the households before and after the crisis. And I'm going to look at their real estate positions, deflate these values by an aggregate house price index. So in this way, this is going to proxy the quantity movements in the portfolios, in the assets of the households. And I'm going to sort the households according to their leverage in terms of deciles here in the rows, and according to their net wealth in the columns. And within each of these groups, I'm going to take the median change in the quantity of the assets that the households own. And three things that I want to highlight from the table are, first, all of the movements or all of the action in terms of the movements in the assets on the real estate or the real estate positions of the households happens on the 10th decile in terms of wealth. So only the rich households are either buying or selling their assets. However, when we also decompose across their leverage, we see that what we expected from these dampening and amplifying effects. The top decile in terms of leverage are the households that had to fire sale their assets and are the ones that fire sale the most. They decreased their asset positions by around 36%. And as we move up the ladder in this leverage, we see that the 9th decile also had to fire sale part of their assets in a much lower amount, but they also had to sell their assets. So this is like this contagion or snowball effect in which the most leveraged households are the ones that get affected the most, but the ones close to the constraint or with high leverages are also affected by the crisis. And as we move up all the way to the low leveraged households, we see that these are the ones that accumulated. So someone had to buy the assets that were sold by the constrained households, and we see that the wealthy ones are the ones that bought all of these assets. So we have heard sometimes in the newspapers or in the media that which is a good time to buy assets? Well, during a crisis, because they are cheap. And that is precisely what the low leverage wealthy households are doing. Now, ultimately, households care about consumption. And here I am going to show you how the households change their consumption also before and after the crisis according to their leverage. And what we find is that there is a positive relation between how much leverage the households had and how much they decreased their consumption. So more leverage, households had to decrease more their consumption. Why? Because the constrained or the highly leveraged households are the ones that have large marginal propensities to consume. They have liquidity problems. And once the crisis hits, they are constrained and they have to adjust the most their consumption, consistent with previous literature. Now, we're ready to go directly into the model. The model is going to be a small open economy asset pricing Bewley model. And there are too many words there, so let me try to be specific on what does this mean. Small open economy, because the households are going to trade one risk-free international bond with the rest of the world with an exogenous interest rate price. That is going to be fixed by aggregate terms. Asset pricing, because the households are also going to trade an illiquid risky domestic asset, this A. This domestic asset is going to have an endogenous price, which will depend on the whole distribution of the households. So this is going to be the price that will have either the dampening or the amplifying forces coming from the distribution of the households. And finally, the Bewley component are the uninsurable idiosyncratic shocks that the households get exposed to either from labor, a la Yagari, or to their capital returns or dividend returns, a la Angeletos and other authors. Now, the main financial friction in this model is a loan-to-value credit constraint, which is the friction that triggers sudden stops as endogenous responses to aggregate shocks. And this credit constraint means the following. The international debt of the household, this B prime, cannot be more negative or cannot be larger in terms of debt than a constant kappa fraction of the market value of the asset of the households. Now, notice that this, in contrast to the rep agent version, this asset, the market value of the asset of the households is composed of two things. The aggregate price, Q, which depends on the whole distribution of the households, and A prime, which is the individual position, which in this case will be different among these households. So when we think about a household that sells part of their assets, this has two effects on the loan-to-value credit constraint. The first one is it tightens the constraint coming from the A prime. But if we think that asset prices are dropping, then there is this aggregate effect which tightens even further the constraint by Q. And notice that this Q affects everyone in the economy. So this generates this pecuniary externality by which the behavior of the individual household affects himself, but through the effect of the price affects everyone else. And this is what is driving the pecuniary externality is going to drive the large sudden stops or the endogenous sudden stops in the economy, and it's going to be the key component to measure both the intensive and the extensive margins of the fire selling of the households. So very briefly, let me describe to you the recursive problem of the household. Here, the household is going to maximize the utility function and their tomorrow's expected value function, subject to a standard budget constraint in which they buy consumption goods, they buy bonds holdings for tomorrow priced at the exogenous interest rate price, they buy tomorrow asset positions at an endogenous price, paying some adjustment costs because these are illiquid. And from the income side, households get labor wages times their idiosyncratic productivity, a la Yagari, plus their returns from the amount of assets that they own. These are the dividends times the assets, also multiplied by an idiosyncratic shock. And lastly, today's current bond holdings that the household brings to the period. Now, the maximization is also subject to the loan to value that I already explained. And for completeness, the adjustment cost function that I'm going to assume is quadratic. This is going to be important for an equity premium decomposition that I do, but besides that, the functional form is not important at all. So now let me spend one slide explaining more about this market incompleteness or Bewley part of the model. I am introducing two individual market incompletenesses. The first one is the idiosyncratic persistent labor productivity, epsilon W, which combined with the implicit assumption of an inelastic labor supply. Remember, the utility function only has C in the as an input. This means that the amount of exposure to the earnings risk is fixed. It doesn't matter what the households do, if they buy or sell assets, if they buy or sell bonds, they are going to get exposed to the same risk every period. Then the second market incompleteness that I am introducing is the idiosyncratic persistent dividend productivity, this epsilon D. Here, in the literature, they have already proven that the variance on these idiosyncratic capital returns or idiosyncratic wealth returns are the main drivers of the wealth inequality. But here in my model, the combination of this dividend risk combined with the loan to value debt constraint is going to generate an asset wealth trade-off from getting more assets. And this means that the intuition behind this asset wealth trade-off is the following. When a household gets one additional unit of the asset, the household increases the right-hand side of the debt constraint. So the household is relaxing their collateral constraint or is increasing their debt capacity. And this allows the household to have a better consumption smoothing and reduces consumption volatility. That is something desired by the household. Now, at the same time, this extra unit of the household increases the exposure to the dividend risk. So for the same amount of bonds, the disposable income, the variance of the disposable income of the household increases. And this, given the same precautionary savings, increases consumption volatility. So these are these trade-offs. I will find that in the calibrated model, the second bullet point dominates for high dividend asset-rich households. And this is something very important because this will generate that the rich households will start holding larger precautionary savings. So they will hold less debt. And if they are lucky enough for a long period of time, they will end up holding positive bonds. So not only this behavior generates unconstrained wealthy households, which are key for the dampening effect, but this behavior generates endogenously well-diversified wealthy households that end up holding positive bonds, positive international bonds, and positive domestic assets, which is something that we see in the data, and it's also that is a result, that is an endogenous result of the model. So now in the 5 minutes that I have left, let me tell you about the quantitative roadmap of the exercise that I do. So I calibrate the stationary model in which I shut down the aggregate international risk, international interest rate shocks. So this is a stationary model. I calibrate it to match Mexico's data moments. Something interesting to say about this calibration is that this is one of the first papers that does the estimation of the labor income risk for Mexico. And for emerging economies, this is going to be different than for the estimations done by the PSID for the US or for UK. Then, building on Krusell and Smith's non-trivial market clearing algorithm, I adapt it to a small open economy, and I solve and simulate the model with aggregate risk. Again, this is one of the first models in which this is done. After a long simulation, I perform an event study analysis in which I identify sudden stops in the model as the periods in which international capital outflows are larger than 2 standard deviations above the mean, something standard in the empirical literature. I average across these episodes, and I do an event study plots comparing the Mexican data with the data coming from the model. And this is what I'm showing you here. Averaging at 0, which is the period of the crisis, these are deviations from the mean. The solid blue lines are the data simulated from the model, and the dotted lines are the averages for the Mexico's crisis. First, we see that all of the crises in the model are triggered by an increase in the interest rate. Not surprising, since it's the only aggregate risk, or only aggregate shock, but not all of the increases end up being a crisis. Why? Because only the increases where there is enough external debt or enough exposure are the ones that end up being a sudden stop. In terms of the current account reversal, the model predicts similar magnitudes than the ones observed in the data, around 3%, and persistent. It takes more than 3 years or periods in the model for the current account to come back to the pre-crisis levels. Asset prices drop. The model is not able to capture the boom prior to the crisis, although I do get a positive slope prior to the crisis. Consumption drops more than asset prices. This is consistent with data. And a byproduct of the heterogeneous framework is that if measuring consumption inequality through the Gini coefficient, the model is able to capture these drops of consumption inequality during the crisis coming from the highly leveraged households that are the ones that drop the most their consumption. Now, in terms of the asset and consumption dynamics during the crisis, in these tables, I am going to show you the exactly same statistics that I showed you with the panel data from the Mexican households, but now coming from the panel of simulated households in the model. And what I find is that the model, in qualitatively, is able to capture that the top leveraged and top wealthy households are the ones that fire sale their assets the most, around 10%, while the low leverage wealthy are the ones that bought these assets. I'm far away from the numbers. Other things are happening during the crisis, but at least qualitatively, we can capture these dynamics. And with respect to the consumption, again, we find a positive relation between more leverage and more drops in consumption. So the households that are highly leveraged are the ones that are most exposed to tightening financial conditions, to drops in asset prices, to a sudden stop. Now, in the last couple of minutes that I have, let me take the model and see what are the effects of having different degrees of inequality. So motivated by the fact that advanced economies have around half of the wealth inequality than emerging economies, I reduce the dividend risk variance by 1/2. This also, like the motivation behind this is that in advanced economies, there are lower confiscation or lower informal high dividends that reduces this variance on the returns of the households. And what I find is that the lower variance decreases the precautionary savings motives, and this allows the households to have more debt. In what I find is that net foreign debt is twice as large, and sudden stops are going to be less severe. consumption and asset prices drop 30% less. In terms of the event study, here I am showing you again in solid the emerging economy and in dotted the advanced economy. The dynamics look very similar. The only changes are in terms of the magnitudes. And as a sanity check, I constructed a database in which I merged sudden stop episodes identified by the literature to data from the World Bank on consumption and GDP drops, and data from other sources on income inequality, the income Gini. And what I find is that the data is only correlation analysis, it's only a scatter plot, but it is consistent with the predictions of the model. In the triangles, I am showing you advanced economies, and in the circles, emerging economies, at the period of the sudden stop. One period before that, which was the Gini coefficient, and due to the sudden stop, what were the consumption drops or GDP drops? What I find is that advanced economies have around 1/2 of the Gini than emerging economies. All of the blue triangles are to the left. And also we find a negative relation between the change and the Gini. This means that more unequal economies experience more severe sudden stops in terms of consumption drops or in terms of GDP drops.
Okay, you have 1 minute.
Yes, thank you, Francisco.
Sure.
So to conclude, in this paper, I studied the cross-sectional dimensions of the debt deflation mechanism. I document empirically that there are 2 reasons why inequality matters for the severity of a crisis. The wealthy unconstrained by the depressed assets, this dampens the downward pressure, while the financially vulnerable households fire sale their assets. This increases the downward pressure. And then using the proposed model of heterogeneous households and an open and a small open economy, I find that the dampening effect dominates. Asset prices in the model with heterogeneity drop less than in the model with representative agents, but consumption drops more. And this is something that is consistent with the data. And finally, when I calibrate the model to match plausible wealth inequalities and other differences between emerging and advanced economies, I find that an advanced economy that is more equal supports larger debt positions and sudden stops are less severe, which is something that we see in the data. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. So unless anyone has any burning questions, in the interest of time, we're going to pass the floor to Eugenio for the second one. Eugenio, take it away. If you want, I'll also let you know if when you're almost done, we're like 1 minute.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francisco.
No problem.
Okay. So can you see my screen? Yes, excellent.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're presenting joint work with Felipe Safi at the University of Virginia, titled Non-Homothetic Sudden Stops, following sudden stop line that Sergio started. I want to continue on that. Okay, so sudden stops, for those who are not familiar with the concept, are events that are typically characterized by large current account reversals, large output declines, asset price declines, investment, consumption. These are very, very events that hurt countries a lot. Now, sudden stops are typically preceded by consumption booms. Okay, one thing we find in the data that made us think a bit more about and ended up motivating our work is that when you zoom in a bit on the nature of the consumption booms, we find that the booms that were fueled more by non-tradable consumption and in worse outcomes. It's the sudden stops that come after a boom that is more intensive in non-tradable goods, non-tradable consumption ends up being much worse. So we were thinking, like, okay, what's so particular about non-tradable consumption? And we kept digging a bit further. And one thing we find in the data is that non-tradable goods have higher expenditure elasticity. So this means that if your income, say, increases by 1%, we find that the non-tradable goods expenditure elasticity is above 1. So which means that if your income increases by 1%, your consumption on non-tradable goods is going to increase by more than 1%, while non-tradables are less than unit elastic. So there's going to be a disproportional adjustment in terms of non-tradable and tradable consumption whenever your income increases, or whenever your income declines. Income declines here are going to be the more important part of the story. So we're thinking, what is a way of, allowing traditional sudden stops model to be able to generate this pattern? Because standard models can usually, to the best of our knowledge, standard models can only have a proportional adjustment in terms of tradables and non-tradables. So what we do here is we allow the standard sudden stop models to account for non-homothetic preferences. So what we end up doing in this paper is super, super simple. We take Bianchi's 2011 standard sudden stop model. This is a model that it's an endowment economy. You can almost solve it by paper and pencil. And when you have a uncertainty, you need to, of course, put it in a computer. But what we do is we generalize it and we allow this model to have heterogeneous expenditure elasticities. So what we find is that sudden stops end up being much more terrible than in the standard setting. And the intuition for this is that when you're hit by a sudden stop, households are going to adjust their patterns of non-tradable and tradable consumption in a disproportionate way. So what's going to happen is that because their income is being reduced, they're going to reduce non-tradable consumption much more aggressively than tradable consumption. Okay, and what this is going to generate is that the relative price of non-tradables in terms of tradables is going to drop even further, even more aggressively than in the standard setting. Okay, so this is going to tighten the budget, the borrowing constraint, and it's going to generate a worse deflationary spiral. Okay, so that's how the mechanism in our paper is going to work, and that's how we generate, we are able to replicate this fact we observe in the data, which is that a sudden stop preceded by large non-tradable intensive consumption booms end up being worse. Okay, now we also find that because the standard pecuniary externality is going to be larger, optimal macroprudential policy will be more aggressive, in the sense that optimal macroprudential policy, when we have heterogeneous expenditure elasticities, will suggest that we should use higher taxes. Okay, so I'm going to skip the empirical part because my goal today is to walk you over the model and give you the, as the most analytical result that, so that you guys can go home with something useful about our paper. So let me start with the model. So the model is pretty standard, these three equations. Okay, so it's the model of Bianchi. We have households that want to maximize the expected discounted lifetime utility by households consume a composite good. C in this case, these are the two types of constraints that households are facing. The first one is going to be the standard budget constraint. The second one is going to be a borrowing constraint, very similar, not exactly like the one of Sergio, but the same spirit. Households cannot borrow more than a fraction kappa of their income. Okay, the way we are going to introduce non-homothetic preferences here is in the way we aggregate or we generate this composite good. Okay, so here we follow Comyn and others. Should update this. I think it just came out in Econometrica, but we follow their paper. And what we do here is we generalize the aggregator. Okay, so this is under certain parametric assumptions, this is going to be a CES aggregator. Now, what we do here is we generalize it because we have some exponents over here, and epsilon t and epsilon n exponents. So composite good is going to be the solution to this nonlinear equation. So in other words, the composite good is going to be built on tradable and non-tradable goods. Okay. What's interesting about this formulation we have here is that when epsilon t and epsilon n are equal to 1, we recover the standard model. Okay, we have the model of Bianchi, so all the conclusions are exactly the same. But when epsilon n is different from epsilon t, this term over here is differs from this one, we're going to have non-homotheticity. Okay, so what we do here is we first characterize what is the expenditure elasticity. So these epsilons here are not going to be exactly the expenditure elasticities, which in the standard setting are simply 1. Now expenditure elasticities are going to be given by this equation, which is simply is going to be something very similar. We're going to be tightly related to these epsilons over here. The next step we do is we look at the data. Okay, we find estimates for expenditure elasticities, and we look at expenditure elasticities of non-tradable and tradable goods. What we end up finding is that non-tradable elasticities are going to be larger than tradable expenditure elasticities. So if you look at this equation, it's super simple actually to show that if the expenditure elasticity of non-tradables is larger than the expenditure elasticity of tradables, epsilon n is going to be larger than epsilon t. So if we want to follow the data, we want to be consistent with the data, we should be departing from the standard setting. Now, this condition is going to be important, and I will show you exactly where it's going to be important. So let me walk you over the first order conditions of the model. So the first equation is going to be, using the first order conditions of tradable and non-tradable consumption, which will allow us to derive the relative price of non-tradables. Now, there's going to be an extra component in this equation. So in the standard setting with homothetic preferences of Bianchi, the relative price would simply be this term over here. Now, when we have non-homothetic preferences, we have this extra component over here. Okay, notice that when epsilon n is equal to epsilon t, this term is simply 1. So we are back to the standard setting. But if epsilon n exceeds epsilon t, this term will be positive. Okay. Now the other first order conditions are pretty standard. We're going to have our Euler equation. Here, mu t is going to be the Lagrange multiplier of the borrowing constraint. We have the borrowing constraint, and then these are the two resource constraints. So how does the amplification of the severity of sudden stops work here? Well, during a sudden stop, the borrowing constraint is going to bind, right? So mu t will be positive. The direct effect is that the marginal utility of tradable consumption is going to go up, which implies that tradable consumption has to decrease. So if you look at this equation for a second, if we were in the standard setting, we have that a decline in tradable consumption depresses the relative price of non-tradables, which in turn affects the valuation of the collateral of the household, which will tighten the borrowing constraint further. Now, when we have non-homothetic preferences, we have this additional term over here. So what's going to happen is that a decline in tradable consumption is not only going to hit the relative price of non-tradables from this side, but it's also going to hit it from this side as well. So we're going to have an additional effect that is going to depress the relative price of non-tradables. And this is going to generate a deflationary spiral that is going to end up being much worse. Again, the intuition here is that when households need to delever, what they're doing is they're going to be reducing non-tradable consumption more aggressively than tradable consumption. And this will hit the relative price of non-tradables much harder than when we have a homogeneous expenditure elasticities. So if epsilon n is greater than epsilon t, we're going to have that a fall in tradable consumption will amplify the standard deflationary spiral we observe in the model of Bianchi. Okay, so before proceeding, let me just mention a couple of things. When the borrowing constraint binds, this is going to hold with equality. So if we combine these two equations over here, the borrowing constraint and the resource constraint of tradables, we can express the relative price of non-tradables as this. You're probably wondering why I'm showing you this. It's gonna come up in a second. Okay, so what we want to do in this paper, our main goal is to hopefully come up with or try to generate as many analytical results we can with just pencil and paper. Okay, so in order to try to achieve this, what we do is we start by performing a perfect foresight analysis. So what we're going to do here is we're going to compare two economies, one with homothetic preferences and another one with non-homothetic preferences. So there's going to be no uncertainty, and we're going to assume that the borrowing constraint is marginally binding. So if the borrowing constraint is marginally binding, it's going to hold with equality, but it's going to be a soft binding constraint, in the sense that households will still be able to afford the unconstrained allocation. Okay, where the unconstrained allocation of tradable consumption is given by this expression, which is the standard the standard case where the household is simply consuming a fraction of its discounted lifetime wealth. Okay, now the two economies are going to have the same initial conditions, the same initial equilibrium, okay, in the two economies. Now there's two curves that we can use to sort of fully characterize a perfect foresight economy. So there's going to be one which we call the BB curve, which is the equation I showed you in the last slide, which is obtained from combining the borrowing and the resource constraint. So we have here that the relative price of non-tradables is going to be given by this expression over here. We have a second expression for the relative price of non-tradables, which we call the PP curve. Okay, and this is the one that comes from the first order conditions of tradable and non-tradable consumption. Okay, and as you can see here in this very simple economy with perfect foresight, we're going to have two equations and two unknowns. So the equilibrium of this economy is going to occur whenever these two curves intersect each other. Okay, so that's how we find the unconstrained equilibrium. What we do next is we simulate a sudden stop. So how do we simulate a sudden stop in this very simple setting? Well, the sudden stop is going to be a wealth neutral shock on tradable endowment. So when I say wealth neutral, what I'm simply saying is the tradable endowment is going to drop initially, and then it's going to increase in the future so that the present value of wealth remains unchanged. Okay, so what we're trying to do, in other words, here is we're trying to push households a bit so that the constraint is actually binding and not marginally binding. Okay, so a wealth neutral shock is going to shift only this curve, and it's going to shift it inwards. So let me show you graphically what's going on. So we have these two curves, the BB curve and the PP curve. The BB curve is a strictly convex function. The other one is simply has a constant slope. So here we have relative price of non-tradables and consumption. So the intersection of these two curves will give us the initial equilibrium for the world with homothetic preferences. When we include non-homothetic preferences, by construction, we have the same initial equilibrium. So point A is going to be the equilibrium in a world with non-homothetic preferences, and it's going to be the same as the one with homothetic preferences. Now, what's going to be interesting here is that, and this is also a property we characterize, is that this curve, the BB curve for non-homothetic preferences, it actually goes from or crosses from below. Okay. The one of the homothetic preferences. So what happens when a sudden stop comes? Well, a sudden stop here it can be interpreted as simply a shift in this curve inwards. Okay, so the sudden stop equilibrium in the two economies is going to be different. So point B is going to be the intersection between the two curves for the homothetic economy world, and point C is going to be the one for the non-homothetic economy world. So as we can see, what this figure is telling us is that our prediction of this very simple model is that sudden stops when we have non-homothetic preferences are going to be worse than when we have homothetic preferences. Okay, the decline in relative prices is going to be larger. The decline in consumption is going to be larger. And the intuition here is the one that I was mentioning earlier. Households here are going to adjust their consumption in a disproportionate way. They're going to reduce the consumption of non-tradables in a more aggressive way, which will hit the price of non-tradables more even further. And this will make the constraint to bind even more, and this will generate a larger deflationary spiral. Okay, so the first analytical result from this perfect foresight economy is that we're going to have amplification of the severity of sudden stops. A second result we can construct is that the amplification is going to be non-monotonic in the size of the shock. So what I'm trying to say here is, well, what if the sudden stop, instead of moving the BB curve from the initial one to this one, was actually moving it from the initial one to the one over here? This is a more severe sudden stop. Well, we still see that there's going to be amplification, but the amplification is not going to be as large as the one we had before. So the larger the shock, the smaller the amplification. Well, and this is going to be, valid only in this region over here, because if we are, say, if initially we had a small sudden stop and then we pushed it further, we would have that amplification would be increasing. So we're going to have that this amplification term is going to be non-monotonic in the severity or of the sudden stop. This is all the severity of the decline of tradable output. And a third result is that we're going to have path dependence. This is the path that led you to a sudden stop is going to be important in terms of determining how large this amplification is going to be. So here we have two possible two scenarios. The first scenario is the one that I showed you already. The one on the right is going to be a scenario where the initial equilibrium was, in some sense, a lower consumption, lower price equilibrium. So the same sudden stop here is going to generate a lower amplification. And the reason is, or intuitively, how we can understand this is that households are reducing their non-tradable consumption, but because their income is lower than in this case, their disproportional adjustment is not going to be as large as in this case where their income was high. So it's going to be state dependent. We're going to have path dependence in terms of the amplification of this. So these are all properties we sort of tease out, we sort of derive from a perfect foresight economy. But of course, this is an incomplete picture because we need to include aggregate risk. When we have aggregate risk, we will have precautionary motives, and that might generate a different story. So that's why we then perform a quantitative exercise. So before jumping to the quantitative section, let me talk a bit about optimal policy. Okay, so in terms of optimal policy, we solve the problem of a social planner. The planner here is going to internalize the fact that borrowing today might generate or might produce a binding constraint tomorrow. Okay, in other words, the planner internalizes the fact that its consumption decisions or its borrowing decisions are going to affect the relative price of non-tradable goods, and hence will affect the value of the endowment of households in the economy. So this is actually pretty standard, because if you take the standard model of Bianchi, you get the exact same equation. What's going to be neat here is that this term over here that shows up in the Euler equation, which is the pecuniary externality component, will have an extra component when you allow for heterogeneous expenditure elasticities. So in the standard setting, the pecuniary externality, the part of the pecuniary externality, which is this partial derivative of the relative price of non-tradables, which is reflecting in some sense how severe the decline in the relative price is going to be when consumption decreases. In the standard setting, we have this term over here. But when we allow for heterogeneous expenditure elasticities, we have this wedge over here, which is going to be strictly positive. So what I'm trying to say here is that the planner is understanding and internalizing the fact that when you have heterogeneous expenditure elasticities, this pecuniary externality is going to be worse. Okay, it's going to be worse because you have this disproportional adjustment, which generates a worse inflationary spiral. So what the planner is going to do is simply going to have a larger pecuniary externality component, which will make the planner to be more aggressive in terms of how to tackle this externality. Okay, we can decentralize the allocations of the planner via debt tax, and debt tax, in principle, the structure is the same as the one in Bianchi, but again, because we have this extra component, we will have that the optimal macroprudential tax will be larger when you have or when you allow for heterogeneous expenditure elasticities. Okay, so this is related to the point I was mentioning at the beginning. Optimal policy is saying we should actually, think twice in terms of how large these taxes are, because if you have heterogeneous expenditure elasticities, then you might want to have even higher taxes. Okay, so how much do I have?
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Quantitative section, let me just keep it because I just wanted to leave you the main story. In terms of the quantitative section, super simple. We take Bianchi's calibration. We calibrate this parameter epsilon n to match features in the data. The main takeaways from this is that in the long run, the two models look very similar, which is actually a pretty neat property. Where things are going to look different is during a crisis. Okay, so during a crisis, we actually find, let me just jump. We actually find that there's going to be amplification of the sudden stop. So in some sense, we quantitatively corroborate the first prediction of the perfect foresight economy, which is there's going to be amplification of sudden stops. Okay. Another thing we also corroborate is we corroborate non-monotonicity and we corroborate path dependence. So all the things that I showed you, where I basically spent most of my presentation, are going to hold in a world with aggregate risk. Okay, so these are just some stuff, but I'm just going to jump because that's the main message I wanted to convey to you. So with this, let me conclude. So what we do in this paper is we use a very simple framework and to generate a model that is able to account for heterogeneous income elasticities between tradables and non-tradables. This ends up generating amplification of the severity of sudden stops. Okay, and also it's very helpful to because it helps us understand why sudden stop preceded by non-tradable intensive consumption booms lead to worse outcomes. And the key element here is that there's going to be this disproportionate adjustment of tradable or non-tradable consumption with respect to tradable consumption whenever your income declines. In terms of the optimal policy, because the pecuniary externality is now larger, this is calling for actually a more aggressive macroprudential policy. We also find that simple rules are actually more effective because the pecuniary externality is larger, so a simple tax or a constant tax or a simple tax structure can actually generate larger welfare gains. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eugenio. I have something that I want to ask you, but maybe I can go after. I think this model with nominal rigidities would be a lot worse also. No, because just to give you the point, you know, if you got consumption of tradables, that's imported or exported, so it doesn't really matter for labor demand. But in non-tradables, that can also have a, I don't know, just to give you the, I don't want to eat into Tamon's time.
Okay.
So Tamon,
we can talk more about this later.
Yeah. I was just burning.
Thanks.
Okay. Can everybody see? Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you so much, Francisco, for arranging and being a chair. Okay, so I'm the third one to speak. So the paper is about the fiscal austerity and sovereign debt relief. This is joint work with Hyunsuke Ju. He's actually at the University of Sarai in UK. Okay. Sorry, as Francisco knows well, and others knows well, usual remarks apply. You have to be clear. You know, sorry. Also, we're dealing a little bit contentious time of the debt crisis. So, view express hearing that those with ours, nothing to do with institution which Francisco and I work. International Monetary Fund, Executive Bonus Management. Okay, let me just quickly go into the motivations. So, the paper is motivated by disconnect between the fiscal austerity and sovereign debt literatures. Okay. So if you look at the fiscal austerity literature, which is mostly focused on the balanced economy, fiscal austerity has nothing to do, well, independent with the debt relief. So it doesn't have anything on debt relief. At the same time, debt relief, which is usually not happening in the balanced economy, doesn't have any impact on the fiscal austerity. So it's a completely independent event, orthogonal to debt relief or debt restructuring, okay, except what we've seen in the Greece case. So then if you look at the sovereign debt and the fiscal policy literatures, you know, what's interesting is debt relief or debt default only affecting the fiscal austerity. But on the other hand, fiscal austerity, we're not going to have anything on debt relief because they only do the debt relief, they only do the consolidation of time of default. Okay. But if you look at the data, which is showing in the status facts, there is a mutual linkage between fiscal austerity and debt relief in emerging on the low-income countries. Okay. What is really happening for is fiscal austerity is affecting debt relief and debt restructuring, even in a crisis time and non-crisis time as well. At the same time, debt relief or debt restructuring has an impact on the fiscal austerity which countries are going to take. So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to do in twofold. One is going to empirics. We actually code a new data set on strategy, fiscal consultations, and debt relief, technical debt restructuring. Okay. Then we present the new status facts on fiscal austerity and the debt relief. The point we're actually showing is exactly what we were seeing in the data before. Is fiscal austerity has impact on debt relief or debt restructuring, but at the same time, debt restructuring or debt relief has impact on fiscal austerity. So we actually see the mutual link in our data set that we show. Okay. Then we go into theory and we actually build the model. Then we actually apply the content analysis as previous speakers already talked about. So technically, the model is like we build a sovereign debt model with the choice of defaults and restructuring and also expenditure, which is include the fiscal austerity. Okay. So the new theoretical explanation that we see is going to fiscal austerity does influence debt relief and debt restructuring, but at the same time, debt relief and restructuring also affect the fiscal austerity. There is a mutual link that we observe in the data that we replicate in the model. Okay? That's exactly what we tried to show. Okay, so then we go to the data part. So data is actually coming from two set of data. One is going to be debt destruction, sovereign debt destruction, which is already done with the Asselman Tubesh 2016 paper that published in Journal of European Economic Association. An updated version of data set available online up to 2020. Okay, so it covers 179 sovereign debt destruction in 97 on the 2020 year, 1975 and 2020. Okay, so there's a two type of debt destruction that we know. One is going to be a post-default restructuring, which accounts for 116 episodes. The other one is going to be preemptive destruction, which is like Uruguay 2003, which is 81 episodes it accounts. Okay, the second data set, which is we actually created, is also the debt distress, but no debt destruction, no default. Okay, so the classification follows from three criteria. Technically saying it's a high expected likelihood of restructuring in ex ante, but at the same time, no restructuring or no overlap with the pre-destruction period as observed in the previous data set. Okay, so neither end of the debt distress or duration at least lasts for 2 years. So there is a period for debt distress, but the countries actually did not go, and there's not any overlap for the debt destruction or pre-debt destruction period that we defined in the previous data set. Okay. Then in the data, so what we account, there is 82 episodes happening in the same period, 1975 and 2020, for the countries at least experienced at least one external private debt destruction. Okay, so we're actually doing two things. One is going to be debt destruction, debt distress episodes, and second one is going to be debt distress, but at the time no restructuring. Okay, on the fiscal consolidation part, we actually used the Asselman-Drew public expenditure consolidation data, which covers a consumption, transfer, investment, and capital for debt crisis events, which we cover in the same sample. So the expenditure consolidations is defined following Aricina and Perotti 1997, which is IMF Economic Review, and which comes with two events. Cyclical adjusted expenditure for more than 1.2% of the GDP in a particular year. At the same time, it could be events that last 2 years, cyclical adjusted expenditure that fall at least 1.25% of GDP in 2 consecutive years. So any of these happen, we call this as an expenditure consolidation year, okay? Then the way we're gonna define is sort of a timing or consolidation. If any of the consolidation proceed before the country is going to default, we actually saw it front-loaded consolidation. On the other hand, it comes after the default, technically year T minus 0, or at the same time with the onset of default, then we actually call it backloaded consolidation. Okay, that's what it means. So with the coding exercise, what we could see is there is a strategy of consolidation relief, okay, which is post-default and backloaded consolidation, and the post-default and front-loaded consolidation, and the post-default but no consolidation. And if you look at the preemptive restructuring, there's also additional 3 strategy: backloaded, front-loaded, and no consolidation. The interesting elements that we actually show, we call the debt distress, but the no default, but it comes with consolidation or without consolidation. There are 8 strategies that we can consider. Then among the 8, we actually see 3 strategies actually dominant what we see in the data. Okay, so let's look at the data. So we actually call the data, look at the how exactly the sort of a strategy is actually mapping to the real episodes of the debt restructuring and the non-restructuring and debt distress. What we could see, we have 3 dominant strategies. One is going to be post-default with the backloaded, and second one is preemptive with the front-loaded consolidation. The last one we see is non-restructuring, but at the same time with the consolidation. Okay, then next we're going to look at how exactly the public investment behave around 2 restructuring sample, which is the preemptive and post-default, and also the 3 sample: preemptive, post-default, and non-debt distress episode, non-restructuring debt distress. The first is, if you look at the public investment dynamics, if you normalize the public investment dynamics at the time the start of the crisis at the 100, okay, then we actually look at the dynamics before 3 years and also after during the debt restructuring. Okay, so this chart is actually show the line for post-default, which is like the pioneer example is Argentina 2001-2005, which is Francesco might know well. So if you clearly see the sharp decline in public investment, then public investment is actually below the pre-crisis, so prolonged years, then it recovers in a 4th year, then the actual settlement. So the orange line corresponds to settlement here. Then if you look at the preemptive restructuring, like one case that we can consider is Uruguay 2003, public investment falls sharply in advance from year T-3 to T-1, then they start recovering in year 0. But before recovering to pre-crisis, the pre-crisis level, they actually have a settlement because the debt crisis resolution is very quick. Okay. Then, if you look at the non-crisis period, which is exactly the Uruguay 2019 to 2019, which is before the happening in a decades ago, 2 decades ago. So you currently see there's a sluggish, sort of a slow recovery, but they actually quick recover to the level. Okay, so only thing what we see is going to investment does only fall short marginally, but it actually quickly rebounds during the distress period. Okay, so technically, what we can summarize, public investment declines sharply in ex ante and preemptive. Okay, but it does fall in ex post. Okay, at the same time, debt settlements actually takes much longer, and also takes longer for the post default than actually happen after the recovery. But in contrast, the preemptive restructuring is going to be public investment recovery is going to take after the country is actually set. Okay. So lastly, if you look at compare the length you spend on duration of restructuring and also time it takes to recover, what occurs is the following. So the investment, the post-default cases, the restructuring duration is like 5.2 years on average, then it's actually longer than countries actually take needs time to have public investment recover to the precursor. But in contrast, preemptive restructuring, duration is shorter than the one it takes for recovery. But look at the recovery period comparing post-default and preemptive, we clearly see that preemptive restructuring gets shorter period in order to get the recover the precursor. Okay? So that's actually what we see. So recovering public investments are much shorter in the preemptive cases than in the post-default. So let me quickly wrap up the 4 status factor we say. So there are 3 dominant debt crisis, debt restructuring / austerity strategies. So we see post-default and backward consolidation, preemptive and front-loaded consolidations, and also non-restructuring, non-default, at the same time, the consolidation strategy. Okay. Then what we could see, if you look at the public investment dynamics, public investment declines sharply in ex ante in a preemptive cases, but it actually exposes in a post-default. Okay. The debt settlements actually takes before the recovery of public investment in a preemptive, whereas takes after in a post-default cases. The last 3 recovering public investments are much shorter than in a preemptive case than in a post-default. Okay. So these status facts actually pose a very interesting question that we try to tackle, right, which is not well known in this literature, is why front-loaded consolidation precede the preemptive restructuring, while the backward consolidation come together with default and non-consolidation. Okay. At the same time, what exactly the consequence of front-loaded backward fiscal consolidation respectively? So that's the big question that we have not really answered in the literature that we try to tackle on this paper. Okay. Frequently focus on default restructuring choice, preemptive defaults and repayments. At the same time, is on crisis resolution, which is a settlement and the delay. Okay, given the time constraint that we have, let me just jump on the implication of paper. So we have 3 technical implications. First, we have a status facts on the fiscal consolidation sovereign debt restructuring, which I already explained. Second is going to be on the theory and the quantitative part, which is the theoretical explanations on sovereign debt crisis resolutions. Okay, particularly focus on 2 parts. We sort of explained the rationale, different rationale for 2 types of fiscal consolidation, front-loaded and back-loaded. At the same time, what exactly the role of these 2 types of consolidation in terms of sovereign debt crisis and resolutions? Okay. The lastly, we saw model quantitatively as in the previous papers, and simply, found that we actually replicate all the status factors we observe in data. Okay. So let me go to the literature review. So papers actually rated the 3 similar literatures, but I try to be brief. So if you look at the fiscal austerity literature, pioneer work has been done by Aresina et al. 2005. Okay, but most of this literature is focused on the balanced economy. They are looking at really consolidation independent. Okay, it's because they don't much default or debt destruction episodes in that sample of the country, which is focused on the balanced economy. Okay, so our paper is actually different because we combine debt consolidations and debt strategies together. Okay, looking at the comprehensive strategy the countries are taking in terms of debt system. Okay. The second is going to be the literature focused on sovereign debt and defaults and fiscal policy. Okay, so pioneer works in Quadra et al. 2010. Okay, and Arellano and Bai 2017. Okay, so what is new in our paper is actually looking at the fiscal policy around preemptive restructuring, which is different from post-default countries actually default. Okay, so that's actually novel. We have a different dynamics of fiscal policy that we see. Okay, the third literature, so there's a growing literature that talk about different types of sovereign defaults and the destruction. My previous work with Crystal Tabesh actually fall in the category as well. And there has been interesting work with a partial default, which is done by Delano et al. 2019. Okay, so what's new here is we're actually looking at, so these two type of destruction happening, but at the same time, we're looking at type of consolidations differ depending on the choice of the fiscal, the destruction they're going to take. Okay. Okay, so let me go to the theoretical finding, a key mechanism that we can explain. Sorry, given the time constraint, I try to provide the theoretical finding. I'm not going to the detail of the model. Okay, and I'm going to explain the quantitative, what's the key part. So technically, if you look at the choice between front-order, back-order consolidation, the key mechanism here is going to be gamble for resurrections. Okay, so countries make a choice between 2 points of time. First is they make a choice ex ante, technically before realization of TFP shock, and the choice between front-loaded or non-consolidation. Okay, then they actually take a front-loaded consolidation when they're certain about the likely default. Technically, you think about you're likely to default in the near future, then you go to the consolidation now. That's exactly the front-loaded consolidation they're going to take. But on the other cases, if they're expecting high TFP to materialize, they are not taking a consolidation. This is non-consolidation strategy. This is going to correspond to gambling in a literature. Okay? Then, if you're not going to take the consolidation strategy, taking non-consolidation strategy ex ante, you actually face the back shock, technically low TFP, then you're going to take a consolidation. So this is going to be ex post choice, which is going to happen. Then this is going to correspond to, you know, the consolidation upon shock. So this is a backward consolidation. Okay. So what exactly the consequence of front-loaded consolidation and backward consolidation? So there's actually two drivers that make into it. One is going to be endogenous fiscal constraint. That depends on whether you have two types of destruction taking place. At the same time, you know, role of public capital here in two types of destruction. Okay. If you're going to take front-loaded consolidation, what's going to happen here? You're likely to more to take a preemptive destruction. The reason why I like to take preemptive destruction is by taking a front-loaded consolidation, you ended up with low level public capital. Okay, so in the low public capital, the cost of destruction is going to be extremely hard. So you like to hedge. By taking a hedge, you're going to willing to go to the preemptive destruction by avoiding a default and lessening the condition. Okay, so the technical preemptive destruction comes from the hedging mechanism. Then by taking preemptive destruction, country can settle it quickly because of the sort of smaller output cost they're going to face, and that's come with relaxation fiscal constraint because you can allocate a resource on simply the debt settlement part, not taking the front consolidation at this stage. If you take a backward consolidation upon the barrierization shocks, what really happens is you're going to default and post default because of low TFP shocks. At the same time, it's going to be delayed negotiation. You stay in a longer period of financial autarky. Is because fiscal consolidation is constraints tight because the consolidation and the capital accumulation is very small. Okay? That's the key mechanism that we see. Okay, given the time constraint, I'm going to go into the quantitative part of the model, okay, which is discuss the key illustration parts in a quantitative manner. Okay, so basically the functional forms and parameter value exactly the same as the literature, so nothing special. We simply assume AR1 process of TFP and household utility function GHH serial utility function. Okay. All the parameters exactly the same. Only the new parameter we introduce is going to be direct productivity loss that we computed based on Asserman Tabesh 2016 finding the output cost for preemptive destruction smaller than on the post default. Okay, just simply both the parameters are computed. Okay, that's the only computed. Unless the parameter, which is actually target value, then we compute the value, which is going to be consistent with what we do in literature. Within public consumption, private and public adjustment cost, and discount rate and bargaining. Okay. So let me go to the key part. Okay, first of all, let's look at the choice between the preemptive post-default restructuring and the non-restructuring based on what we see in the data, and what we see in a statistical distribution. Okay, the country make a choice between preemptive and non-preemptive choice in ex ante, then actually make a choice between repayments and default and default. Okay, let's simply look at the mean public capital, right? So it's the simplicity. So we have debt on the vertical axis and the TFP on the horizontal axis. Okay. So in ex ante, country willing to take preemptive options in a blue line, which is shown here, when debt is high and income is low. Okay. Upon realization of shocks, countries willing to take default when income is low. All right. At the same time, debt is high. If you're going to combine this chart, it's going to happen here. So in ex ante, country willing to do a preemptive of this range when debt is high enough. So they like to hedge. Okay, so they like to go to the preemptive. Then if the country is not taking a preemptive option in ex ante, if you are on either on the orange or the left, upon realization of bad shocks, you're willing to take the positive. Okay? So that's exactly the explanation that we had in the Asselman to Best 2016 paper. So this is not the contribution in this paper, but our papers actually replicate exactly the same. Our contribution is going to be coming this one. So now we're looking at exactly how consolidation likely to be associated with the restructuring strategy countries will take. If you're going to take a front-loaded consolidation, which is you actually take the soft consolidation, which is going to be shown on the purple line, purple region here. If you're in the default and the positive for restructuring, you take in the hard consolidation, which is the black region here. Okay. In the region, when you are actually in the current debt, you have a good credit record, you're still willing to take hard consolidation when you cross the boundary of defaults and non-default. Okay. Technically saying you're expecting high likelihood for default, you still like to take the hard consolidations in order to minimize the sort of improve the fiscal situations. Okay. At the same time, in the intermediate regions, you're really need to take a soft consolidation. So let's combine this together with the previous slides. There is a region for front-loaded consolidation when the country's credit record is good, which is countries in a good credit record, countries actually repay, but taking hard consolidation. And there is a region corresponds to backloaded consolidation upon default, which is countries in default and positive for negotiation, and they like to take hard consolidation. So we replicate the rationale, the countries willing to take a front-loaded consolidation when they are in repayment status. Okay. So let's look at the quantitative model. So our models actually replicate the shares of consolidation we observe in the preemptive restructuring and also the positive restructuring. Technically, front-loaded consolidation actually outweighs the one in the preemptive restructuring. Okay. We have a nearly model explicit non-consolidation as well, which is what we're actually doing now. Okay. Same thing happening in a positive. What we could see is going to be the backloaded consolidation exceeds the one in the front-loaded consolidation as also. Then let's look at the dynamics of public investment around the debt restructuring and debt distress as well. Okay, first look at if your country is going to front-loaded consolidation and preemptive. This is exactly the Uruguay 2003. You see matched with the data, which is the baseline cases shown in the red line, instead drops and the quick recovery. Okay, that we see. And there's a quick settlement because it only lasts 1 year. Okay, in the Uruguay case, it's only 1 quarter.
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, then if you go for front-loaded consolidation, non-consolidation, we could see a quick recovery because what could see front-loaded consolidation, there's a quick rebound in a public investment. Okay, so let's look at the Francesco Conci, Argentina. Sorry, I'm not blaming anything about Argentina. It's simply, this all the literature is like to replicate Argentina 2005, so that's what we do. Okay, so what we could see is slightly different from previous chart. We could see a sharp decline in public investment we see in the data. Then we actually replicate sharp decline and the slow recovery of the settlements. The next settlements actually takes longer, much longer, longer duration. Okay, so that's what we replicate. Okay, so lastly, if you look at the comparing the duration restructuring and recovery, in a preemptive restructuring, durations on average like 1 year. Okay, then recovering public investment takes 1.8 years. So recovering public investment takes after the country regain market assets in Argentina. If you look at the positive restructuring that we did for Argentina, we currently see recovering public investments is actually take 2 years, then it actually proceed before the settlement. So public investment recovered to the pre-crisis level first, and there is a settlement that takes, which is longer than the recovering public investment. Okay, so let me quickly wrap up. Hope I didn't eat someone else's time. Okay, so we have a 3 implication. One is going to be new status facts and fiscal expenditure consolidation, and also sovereign debt restructuring. Second, we build a model and provide a new theoretical explanation of sovereign debt crisis resolutions. Okay, focus on rationale for 2 types of fiscal consolidation that we see, and exactly how these 2 types of consolidation play a role in sovereign debt crisis resolutions. Okay, from loading back. The last 3 we see quantitative model actually rationalize all status factors of sovereign debt. Okay, stop here. That's it from my side.
All right, thank you so much, Simon. If no one has any burning questions again, I'm gonna start. So thank you so much for staying until the end. I'm very glad to be presenting this paper here. I'm sorry, just moving people over on this side. So this is joint work with Francisco Roch, who is also at the IMF, and of course, you know how this goes. Nothing I say is the opinion of no one else except for the two of us. Right. So in this paper, we have a very simple question, really. There's a, if you want, there's common sense, but also very long literature that talks about the benefits of state contingent debt, of indexing the debt of governments to, for example, the GDP of the country or other variables like that. And they have tons of benefits. If they would have tons of benefits. For example, you know, if you index your payments to the economic situation of the country, that releases resources for the fiscal in bad times. So it allows you to have a less procyclical fiscal policy. It reduces default risk, and in general, it would just, you know, make a better allocation of risk between the country and its external creditors. Okay, so the question is, why do countries finance themselves using non-contingent bonds? So where are all the GDP index bonds that would be so great if one trusts the literature, right? So the first thing that you notice when you look at data on the few state contingent bonds that exist is that the prices looked like they're really bad, right? They're really low prices for this type of debt. And so it's hard to say what's a low price and a high price for a state contingent bond respect to a non-contingent bond, because you have to take a stance on what is the probability of the different payment events that the bond is promising, right? With non-contingent debt, you know what it's promising without having to have a model of GDP of the country. With contingent bonds, you have to do that. And so, for example, there's this paper by Costa, Chamon, and Ricci, who look at the GDP-linked bonds issued by Argentina in 2005. All right, so this paper 2008, just 3 years after the bond was issued. And what they have a Monte Carlo experiment to try to figure out what's the probability distribution of GDP for Argentina going forward, and they use that to come up with like an actuarially fair value for the bond. Right? They compare that price to the price that the market price of those bonds, and convert those differences into spreads. Right? So they find very large spreads. They take out some stuff that you can, for example, default risk from other securities, and things like that. And they still have a very large receipt, which they call novelty, because the bonds were new at the time. Right? But for example, there's also work currently being done by some colleagues here at the IMF, where they basically replicated this paper they extended the sample to 2020, right? So they have now 15 years of data instead of 3 years, and these residuals are still there. So they're not really novelty. They're more persistent. So now the name is more difficult to justify. So what we're going to do is we're going to write down a model, right? We're going to borrow from the finance literature, from asset pricing, to come up with a model that rationalizes the prices of the state contingent bonds that we see. Okay, so our model is going to be based on this idea that foreign investors maybe don't fully trust their model and have these preferences for robustness, like Hansen and Sargent or Poser and Press in the context of sovereign debt as well have used. Right. So this, I'm not going to talk about robustness, especially in a super short presentation, but you should think of this as souped-up risk aversion, or if you want, kind of endogenous pessimism, right? So this idea the lenders don't trust the model that they're using to price the bonds leads them to overestimate maybe the probability of states where they're doing badly, right? They're concerned that the model is not capturing all the risk, and so what they're going to do is they're going to lift a little bit the probability of the states where they're doing really badly. Okay, all right. So our model, in a nutshell, is going to give us a few implications. The first implication is going to be that state contingent bonds do not have to have a bad price per se. It turns out that the structure of that is, by the way, shared by the Argentinian bond, but also by the other few instances of issuances of state contingent bonds, for example, Ukraine or Greece lately. They have this structure where no payments are made for a really large region of the state space, right? So there's a very low likelihood of actual repayments. For example, for Argentina, the GDP-linked bond stipulated that payments were only made if GDP growth was 3% or higher, right? So there are details. If it was higher than 3%, there was some formula, some stuff that was happening. But if GDP grew less than 3%, you would get no payments at all, okay? And if you stood at in 2005, 3% would be about, or maybe a tiny little bit below what you would have estimated, what you could have estimated as the long run growth rate of the economy. Right? So we're going to take this and say that these bonds, you know, they promise to pay if output is at the mean or high. or higher. So if below the mean, you're not getting any payments. So 50% of the time, roughly, you should expect to get no payments from a bond like this, right? And this structure, which is also, Ukraine and Greece have similar structures. This structure is going to go very badly with the robustness of the lenders. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in a larger setting. So the main results that we're going to have from our model with robust lenders and state contingent debt are that, as I was saying, this structure with if you put a threshold in good times, that goes really badly with the stochastic discount factor of these people, and so they're going to discount the bonds very, very harshly, and as a result, the government will actually prefer to issue the non-contingent bond to issuing our representation of the Argentinian GDP-linked bond. Okay, so that's our answer to why don't countries issue these why weren't the issuance of state contingent bonds so unsuccessful? Why weren't they more successful? Well, because you actually prefer to issue normal bonds. Okay. The second thing is that it might look like I'm cheating here. I told you there's a problem with state contingent debt, and we're going to solve it by introducing robustness. So it kind of seems like I have a free parameter to match whatever I want. Okay. So I want to be very clear that that's not the strategy we're going to follow. We're going to follow a strategy where we're going to calibrate all of our model, including the robustness parameter, everything, to data only with non-contingent debt. Okay, so we're going to have a version of our model with non-contingent debt, and we're going to calibrate that to the case of Argentina. Okay, and we're going to evaluate a move from the non-contingent bond model to issuing the Argentinian GDP-linked bond. Okay, and so in that case, and then we're going to ask, does the government prefer this move or not? And by the way, quantitatively, when we do this, we're going to look at the prices, the equilibrium prices of the state contingent bond in the country issues a state contingent bond, and we're going to find that those match the novelty premia estimations that I was showing you in the previous slide. Okay? And then finally, probably not a lot of time in this presentation, but if I can, I'm going to say a few words about, if this structure is so bad, is there a structure that allows you to deal with it better? And what should that structure look like in the world with robust lenders? Okay. So I'm going to spend most of my time looking at the stylized two-period version of our model, where we can get some insights, maybe similar to what Eugenio was doing, and then a few words about the quantitative version. Okay. So in our simple model, we're going to go as simple as we can. Okay. So we want to really focus on the lender. So we're going to have a two-period economy. We're going to have the government of a small open economy issuing debt to some foreigners. Okay, that's very standard. We're going to have, so in the first period, everything is deterministic, but in the second period, there's a shock that determines the level of output in the economy. Okay, so it's an endowment economy. Endowment in the second period is Y of Z, Z is the shock. Okay, and we're going to say the government has, it can issue debt with only one asset. So it's fully incomplete markets. There's only one type of assets. The twist is that the asset promises to repay a return, promise a repayment that may depend on the state. Okay, and so we're going to do comparative statics by varying this R function to compare different types of bonds. Okay, so a few benchmarks. You can do non-contingent debt by setting R to 1 all the time. Okay, so also I should have said the government can default on the debt exposed. Okay, so you can have non-contingent debt by setting it to 1. You can have what we call linear indexing, where you make the repayments a linear function of the state. So here the mean is going to be normalized to 1. So really your payments are a linear function of how far away output is from its mean. You have this threshold debt, which is going to be our representation of the Argentinian GDP-linked bond, where you make payments only if the state is above some threshold, which here we're going to also set to the mean in the case of the Argentinian bond, but you could vary the tau, and have different things. And then finally, in the case of the two-period model, we can also allow the government to design this R function with complete freedom, right? So this will be the same thing as I'm going to give you RO securities for each possible realization of the state, and then I let you do whatever you want. Right? And so in this case, our notation already has this theta parameter here. This is already anticipating that the optimal design depends on the level of robustness of the lender. Theta is a robustness parameter. Okay, so the best debt that you can have depends on who you're trying to sell the debt to. Right? Okay. So the government problem is going to be super simple in this setting. We want to be as simple as possible. There's a utility function. The government maximizes the expected utility from the two periods. It has a discount factor, the borrower's beta. Okay. And the budget constraints just tell you that in the first period, you consume your endowment plus whatever you get from issuing the debt. Right. So the government takes as given a price schedule for the debt, understands how lenders are pricing the bonds. Okay. In the second period, this is indicator of default D that the government will choose in the second period. All right. And so if you choose to default, you have some output costs, very standard. If you choose to repay the debt, the twist now is you have to repay the debt times whatever the repayment function said you were supposed to repay in that state. Okay. What's more interesting is the lenders. Okay. So our lenders, this is where the robustness business will come in. We're going to represent robustness preferences with this multiplier setup, where let me just walk you through the equation. So there's no utility function here. So these people are really, their actual preferences for risk are risk neutral. Okay, so they're linear, they're linear in consumption, but they have these, instead of taking expected values for the future, they have this funky little operator here. Right? So if you look at it, it's the logarithm of the expectation of the exponents. And so if you think about this for a second, you will see that there's like a Jensen inequality term going on here, right? And the theta, which comes in, inside the exponent and outside the log, is really controlling the size of the distortion. Right? So a larger value for theta is going to imply larger distortions in the probability distribution. Okay, and of course, if theta goes to 0, you see it better in a second, but you recover rational expectations with where people take the expectation, just the expected value. Okay, the budget constraints for the lenders are really simple. It's a 2-period model, so the value function is just consumption in the second period. And then the budget constraints tell you that they get their endowments and then they get the repayments if the government chooses to repay. And in the first period, they have to finance debt of the government. That's it. The only reason why we want to have this problem is because we want to look at the Euler equation that prices the bonds. Okay, so the Euler equation looks very standard, except it has this stochastic discount factor term in there. But if you just don't look at it for a second, the price of the bond is really the discounted expected value of the repayments that the lenders expect to make, right? And so they have to take an expectation of the indicator of repayment, 1 minus the indicator of default, times the repayment function, which tells you how much what kind of return they will make in each state if the government chooses to repay. So stochastic discount factor, if you look at it more closely, it has a few properties. One is that it's the exponent of something, and so this is a non-negative random variable. The second observation is that it's something divided its own expectation. So this ratio has expectation 1, okay, and therefore this is a non-negative variable with expectation 1. This means this is really a likelihood ratio. Okay, so this is a change of, if you want, you can interpret this discount factor as a stochastic discount factor, or you can interpret it as these lenders are risk neutral, but I'm taking an expectation not with nature's distribution, but with a particular distribution that these people have in mind. Okay, that's the interpretation we're going to follow. This is what in the literature this is called the worst case model of the lender. This twisted distribution reflects, that the lenders are magnifying the likelihood of states where they're doing bad. Okay, and because these distortions, they're endogenous because they depend on the value function of the lenders, which depend on everything that's going on in the economy. This is the exact point where designing the bond will allow the government to control the distortions that the lenders will impose on the government and ultimately control the price. Okay, so this is where there is scope for the bond design to affect the equilibrium properties of this bond. Okay, so I'm spending a lot of time on this because I really want to show you what these probability distortions look like. Okay, so that's where I'm going. Okay. So I'm going to show you 1 or 2 plots like this. So this here I'm showing you. Let's just focus on the upper part. I'm showing you the distorted. So I told you just now that the lenders use a distorted model to evaluate probabilities. This is what I'm showing you here. So as a function of the robustness parameter, as I said, when theta is 0, you cover rational expectation. So the dark blue line here is the actual distribution of the state. This is the output state tomorrow. It's in the objective distribution. It's a normal with mean 1 and some variance. Okay. The yellow dotted line here on top is the default probability, the default decision of the government. And so when the state is really bad, the government defaults on the debt, and when the state is good, the government repays. Okay. So now, because the government decides to default in these states on the left, the lenders don't get repayments in those states. So those are states that are bad for them. Okay, because they are bad for them, the more robustness, the higher theta is for the lenders, the more they want to be covered against possible misspecification of their baseline model, the more they want to cover themselves against this risk. And the way they do it is by overestimating a little bit the states here on the left. Right? So a little bit of a nerdy comment is that if in this model, when the government defaults, the repayment of the lender is the same. It doesn't matter, if you default, if you were just on the edge of default, you were just here, or if you were way on the left. So the distortion, the lenders don't care where you are. They care that you default or you repaid. And so the amount of distortion is the same always, but because you're multiplying it by the density, you get this non-parallel shifts. On the right, everyone kind of all the states symmetrically are distorted downwards by the same amount. So if you look at the whiter density, it kind of looks like a truncated normal with an increased normal on the other side, right? Now this whiter density doesn't really, it is distorted. It has a lower mean, etc., but it doesn't look at dramatic shifts. Now, if I show you what happens when I try to sell these people the Argentinian bond, the bond that promises to repay only if the stays above the mean, the distortions will be of the same size, but the area in which these distortions are present is much bigger. And so what you get is distorted probabilities that look very different now. Okay, so with the same amount of distortion, again, because it's multiplicative, if you apply the distortion in states that have a lot of density, you get a much higher change in the density itself. But at the same time, it's a larger region, so you get a more distorted distribution. Right? So if you want, the mean of the white distribution here is a lot more distorted than the mean was here. Right? Okay. And so what this implies is that if I want to design the optimal bond that I could sell to these robust lenders, what I would do is, as a function of the state, what I would do is, for example, for Russian expectations, I would promise to repay 0 in the lower states and then have some slope. I want to buy insurance from these risk neutral lenders, right? I'm risk averse and risk neutral, it just makes sense, right? And I just want to buy insurance from them. Now, the more robustness not the government, but the analyst, the more robustness I give the lenders, the more probabilities get distorted when the government tries to sell insurance to the lenders, right? And therefore, the government doesn't want to do so much of that. And so what it tries to do is it tries to even out the repayment function, right? It wants to even it out, even considering that it might default in some states. So you really never want to design a function where you will have default risk exposed. So that's a very silly observation that one can make. If the government is designing the whole contract, it's not going to subject itself to default clause. It might as well say, I'm not going to repay in these states, and let's save the output going down. But anyway, when robustness increases, you become subject to this probability distortion, and you really don't want the effect on the prices that they have on you. And so you really make an effort to untilt the repayment function, even in the lowest possible states where it's really costly for you to repay in those states. But you still want to promise something, because if you don't do it, the prices move against you. Right? Okay. So this is the two-period model in a nutshell. Let me spend 2 minutes on the quantitative version. It's very standard.
Francisco,
yeah.
Could you give
Go
just
ahead.
one intuition on why there is a kink below the mean, like the
Here?
one? No,
In the one.
the kink. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I think in Russian expectations, you mean? So just for the bluer one, not the robustness ones.
In every
in
every line.
Yeah, they have some concavity. Actually, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's because the state is normal, and so maybe you want your insurance function to replicate some of those properties. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think it's an artifact of robustness, because the Russian expectations version also has it. But yeah, so we're doing this on a super fine grid, so it's not that it's not have 5 points and then the linear it goes like that. It's actually very high concavity, and in some cases it may look like a kink. Yes, now I don't have anything super smart to say about that. Maybe the papers in the ages were designing this with Russian expectations, and maybe they have something like this. Before Eaton and Gersowitz and all those people came around. It's a good point. It's a good point. We've been getting into this question quite a bit, and we're not really sure. Okay, so in the quantitative, we can't do this whole design the bond, because the quantitative model is a little bit more complicated. It has long-term debt, etc. But what we can do is we can keep the linear indexation, the alpha parameter you had just now, and we can keep the threshold. And so we're going to do that. We're going to have a bond that has this geometrically decaying coupons, but the coupon itself depends on the state with this linear indexation and with this threshold. Right? So if you set, the indexation, the linear indexation to 0 and the threshold to -infinity recover the standard model. Okay, so in the standard, so this is what we're going to do in just again 5 seconds. In the standard model with non-contingent debt and robustness, okay, this is where we calibrate. We give the government non-contingent debt and calibrate all the parameters, including robustness, to match the Argentinian data. So we get the standard moments from this literature, the spread, the standard deviation, the spread, the debt to GDP ratio, and the default probability. Okay, so if you compare this world with Russian expectations, you basically, so all the same parameters, but then you take theta to 0, you get basically the same model, a little bit more debt, but the same model with a higher default probability. Okay, this is also a paper by Pozo and Preston in 2016. The robust lenders overestimate the default probability, and so you get to keep the default probability constant and spreads a bit higher because the lenders are overestimating the default probability, so they're charging you higher spreads. Okay, in the Russian expectations world, you can shifting from non-contingent debt to the threshold bond. It's a great idea because it decreases the default probability almost to 0. You never pay anything below when output is below the mean, so you're not going to default almost ever. Your deviation of your variance of consumption relative to output really drops because now you're buying a lot of insurance. And because the default probability is so low, your spreads are really low because Russian expectations, the default probability and the spreads are basically the same thing, right? And because you get insurance at a reasonable price, you get welfare gains. So the government is indifferent between the non-contingent debt world with consumption increase by 1.19% or the move to the threshold bond. Okay? In the case of robust lenders, these welfare gains are now welfare losses, right? And they're welfare losses not because the default probability becomes higher, not because you're not buying insurance, because your predictive consumption is still pretty low, but because of the probability distortion I was just showing you in the 2-period model. Now, when you try to sell this high level of insurance, this threshold bond to the robust lenders, they charge you really high spreads. They charge you 11%, when the default probability is 0, right? So it's only because they're scared of the. So here also spreads are measured over the actuarially fair value, right? So they're charging you this high interest rate over and above what would be, the fair price of the bond. Okay, and because they're charging so much, you actually your consumption level drops, and then you end up with welfare losses. Okay, so one thing is that if you just take out the threshold and do linear indexation instead, it already gives you welfare gains. So in a way, the threshold gives a lot of risk to your lenders, and gives you not a great amount of insurance for you. You'd rather have something smoother to insure yourself. Okay, so a few words about how things work in the, if I allow you to choose alpha and tau with more freedom, you get higher welfare gains in the case of robustness than in the case of alpha equals to 1 that I just showed you before. So just to close, you have a standard model of sovereign debt just augmented with these robust lenders calibrated to match the facts for non-contingent debt. And when we evaluate, like literature, the puzzle does, we evaluate the move towards state contingent bonds, who are the state contingent bonds that were issued in reality. We find that our model accounts for the spreads, rationalizing what has been called as a novelty premium, but was really a residual, a puzzle. Our model, kind of through the lens of our model, we get this idea that the threshold structure, where you don't make any payments for in a high probability event, that's a really bad idea, at least in the context of this robust lenders model. And of course, you can do better by designing the bond in a smoother way. But whatever you do, the more robustness the lenders have, the lower your welfare gains, both for any given instrument, but also for the optimal one. Okay. So that's all for me. I'm happy to we can talk about the other papers too. I think we have a few minutes before they kick us out. I'm not sure how this is going to work. So that's all for me.
Great. I do have a question, Francisco. How, in the rational expectations framework, how does the threshold bond pricing relates to a derivative pricing, like a call call option? And that is why I was puzzled about the kink in the payout part, because like in a call option you just have like, after some threshold, this pays in a linear way. But I would think that there is a mapping 1-to-1 between the derivative pricing and the rational expectations framework, but I don't know if you have thought
Yeah.
about using
Yeah, no,
the machinery
yeah,
of derivatives.
yeah. Actually, a few days ago, I got a similar question from a finance person. So I've been thinking about the relation with this and the call options. Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely something there in the sense that with the threshold bond, you have this, there's a bond that pays zero half the time, so you can think that's where you don't exercise the option and so on. But related to the kink, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it goes. It comes from that feature. I think it might have more to do with the default costs. You're issuing a lot of debt, and so we have something in the two-period model. We have something very stark, which is you have quadratic output costs, right? And so maybe what happens is that maybe that's the constraint that's binding in some states, and that's where you get the kink. Yeah, so I think that might be. So it's not something with the derivatives. I think that's more what's going on there. But yeah, no, definitely for the threshold bond, we haven't pursued it in the paper. We could have some relation with some standard asset pricing formulas and compare those. I mean, it could also work in the case of robustness, I think, because we borrowed robustness from the finance literature. So I'm sure they have something smart to say that maybe we haven't thought about yet. So it's a good point.
Francisco, I have a quick question. So do you observe these instruments also for other economies, not only Argentina? Do you also see a behavior like the one, like a not crazy behavior, but bonds being heavily discounted or very low prices?
Yeah. No, yes. Yeah. So I didn't have time to go into that. So some of our colleagues here, they were working. So this paper actually started as something else, and as part of the something else, there was this empirical, more empirically focused part where they're really studying these state contingent bonds. The Ukrainian one and the Greek one, and they also have this structure where they don't pay anything if output is below, something like the long run growth rate of the economy. And in this replication, what our friends are doing is they take out the default risk of the other securities that are around, so like the paper I was mentioning, and they also take out a little bit of liquidity premium. So they take, they have data on the beta spread, and they kind of figure out like back of the envelope, right? But they figure out how much is the price they can explain with those two features, and the rest is what they call the residual, what we call the novelty premium. And those are really, really, really big for both of them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, of course. So actually, it was also a bit strange because in the 2008 paper, the residual for Argentina kind of diminishes over time, but that's just a feature of the sample because after 2008, there's the crisis and so on, but in the 2010s, it comes back. So it looks like a downward trend if you looked from 2008, and then afterwards it just turned out that it was just those 2 years that it was falling.
Yeah, I was asking you the question because I was a bit curious about, it's sometimes when you say like, oh, GDP has to be above this number and this number, you need to first measure GDP. So like if things are tricky, or it's hard to measure actual GDP, it can be maybe like people say like, you know what, I'm not sure even what real GDP is or the actual GDP is, so I'm just gonna discount it super heavy. But if it's true for all other countries, then this cannot be the story. So it has to be something else.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, so there's a few things actually about that. The first thing is that, yeah, of course, this is not just an Argentinian thing. One of our referees actually was complaining that, this is just Argentina being how Argentina is. And so, the other countries kind of give you some confidence that you're picking up something. But the other thing is that if anything, right, so if anything, in the case of Argentina, one would expect that maybe GDP was overestimated, right? Because if the concern is that you're underestimating inflation, you're actually overestimating real growth. And actually, yeah. So I'm from Argentina, and a bunch of my friends who were older than me and were trading these bonds at the time. They made fortunes. They made really high returns on those bonds, and they were really happy about that. The last thing. Wait, hang on. I want to say something else. It was the smartest thing I had to say. With the, well, no, I forgot. If I remember, I'll tell you. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. So if I think that in that case we can close it here. Not sure how you guys feel, but great job from the three of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much,
I
guys.
think I saw Felipe present your paper, Eugenio. a
He
little while ago.
presented in the SC. Were you there?
Was it the